Hey everyone, just wanted to do this video to try and explain exactly how the C-coat thin film insulating coating works. You'll see in a minute that the surface temperature can read high on thermometers, but the effective surface temperature is actually much lower than what the thermometers read. So the first thing I thought I'd show you is just how much the way you measure temperature affects the perception of insulating coatings. So this here is in Fahrenheit. This is on a bit of concrete slab with about 1 millimeter of C-coat over the top. There's no other coatings over the top of the C-coat for that middle strip, and it's measuring about 171 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 77 degrees Celsius. If we use the laser thermometer, we're getting pretty similar results, maybe a little bit higher, but look what happens. The surface temperature between these two should be pretty similar, but you get a big difference between the one with the urethane on it, pole coat, and the one with just the C-coat. And there will be a little bit of difference as well there, which is just a thin film urethane top coat. We come over here. This is just a surface contact thermometer. It's reading about 101 degrees on the steel. And there you go. So it's mainly, this particular one is mainly due to the emissivity of the steel is very different to a paint finish. Now the interesting thing is that this is reading quite high. Now that's reading 115 degrees Celsius, which is anything over 60 degrees is effectively an instantaneous burn. So I shouldn't be able to do that for any amount of time. No tricks, hands on that, okay? So the effective temperature of that is probably around 50 degrees, okay? Still sitting at 100. Now the interesting thing about this here is a different type of surface thermometer. It's reading 76. So the surface contact thermometers are pretty good in a steady state situation. But again, you know, if that's 75 degrees, I should be getting burnt instantly, and I'm not. It's actually just feels nice and warm. Probably about 45, getting up close to 50 degrees. Okay. So what I'm going to show you next is that even with the temperatures that high, we can put ice on the surface of this and it'll melt like it's just sitting on a normal bench. So this is just ice straight out of our freezer. Try and get ones that are similar size. Put one there. No tricks, this is normal ice straight out of the tap. So that's about 1/2 millimeter thick, or it's spot on 1/2 millimeter thick. That one there is about 1 millimeter thick. Should have done that up the other way. As you can see, this one here is melting quite quickly. It's basically just a boiling point. So you can see the temperature's dropped a little bit there because it's ice water and it's wicking the heat away. But as you can see here, these have barely even started melting. Massive difference. Okay, and even though that is showing as 100 degrees Celsius surface temperature, when we put the thermocouples in it. It's still sitting, that's 182, so that's about 83 degrees Celsius. That's just there to hold the tip of that thermometer on, by the way. So we'll let these just simmer away there. What would be good to do is just check. I'll put this in here so that we can measure. I'll leave that sitting there as well. As you can see there, that's measuring 29 already and dropping. That one's a little bit colder, but nothing compared to that. So that there, the water right next to the ice cube, is about 28 degrees. And that's a mixture of the heat coming through from the plate below and the coolness of the ice. So it just shows you the kind of temperature gradient that you can withstand in 0.5 millimeter of sea coat. Okay, these ones here are still sitting there, not really doing much at all. That's still at 184 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, 82, 83 degrees Celsius. We'll try and explain just how this coating is actually working. So what we've essentially got is we've got a heating element on one side. So we've got heat coming up, penetrating through the substrate. Now on the left hand side it's steel, on the right hand side we've got concrete. I left these there for about 3 hours, by the way, just so that they were up to a steady state temperature. Essentially, so that substrate is getting up and maintaining whatever temperature this is putting into it, and then the temperature is trying to come through and radiate through this coating, but it can't do that very effectively. The reason is the coating's got millions and millions of tiny little vacuum filled ceramic beads, and what happens, that acts in a number of ways to actually reduce the transfer of heat through it and the speed at which the heat transfers through that coating. So essentially your heat comes up through here, pretty much a straight line. That steel doesn't slow it down at all. Concrete slows it down a little bit, but not enough compared to the sea coat to actually change these results. So what happens when it gets to the coating is it's trapped, it's stopped by, as soon as it hits one of the ceramic beads or one of the reflective components of the matrix. It's not just reflective beads, it is a whole host of different things that they've got in the matrix here. But we'll focus on the beads for now because they do the majority of it. It hits the ceramic. The ceramic doesn't transfer heat well at all. So that's one element. And because it's vacuum filled, heat doesn't travel through the vacuum either. So essentially the only way the heat can get through this is to take a very long path around all those little ceramic beads. So effectively you've got a thin coating with a whole heap of beads in there that effectively act like double glazed windows, but with the added benefit of just making the heat travel in a path that is quite long compared to what it would normally travel. So what that means is you still get that surface temperature here. Over time, the temperature of that surface can still be very similar to the substrate temp. Okay? It really depends how quickly the temperature at the surface is being wicked away by other elements. So it could be wind, it could be ice, snow. So the reason why the surface temperature can essentially be the same as the substrate, or it normally sits about 10 degrees lower than the substrate temp, the actual temp, just because the ambient air can wick away a certain amount of heat. but that's when it's at a steady state. So it's the heat from within and from the substrate has come through and basically filled up that entire coating. The thing that makes a difference is when you put something on the surface like a bit of ice or like a finger, essentially whatever you put on the surface wicks away the heat from the very top part of that coating, and because of the extremely slow rate of transfer of heat through that coating, the heat can't be replaced at the surface quick enough to actually maintain a high temperature. And it's actually the blood flowing through your finger that wicks away the heat from that surface, which means that there's a certain rate at which that can happen where you don't burn yourself. So that's why there's a big difference between what we read at the surface and what we actually equate that to in terms of touch hazard. So for instance, something around 90 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Celsius being read on the surface using a contact thermometer, that equates to an effective temperature of about 50 degrees for the majority of the coatings. And that means that you're not aiming to get, you know, a reading with one of these things or even a normal contact thermometer. You don't worry so much about the actual reading at the surface, you worry about what it feels like, particularly if you're going for contact protection, or protection of the personnel. It's up to about 190 degrees now. Yeah, it's still sitting around that. So we're looking at 87.8 degrees Celsius. Had a little bit of water sort of flowing off the side there, as you can see, but yeah, nothing compared to that, obviously. This one here has melted. This is a little lower temperature than what this one was, but also 0.5 millimeter thickness of coating versus about a millimeter thickness of coating. So you can see the difference that thickness makes. It's still important, just like regular insulation. So what's that sitting at? 79 degrees Celsius. Interesting. Which is basically the temperature of that water, not the actual substrate itself. If we go and check that one, it's at 63.7, sitting on that surface there. So we see huge benefits in electricity usage or energy usage to try and, when you're trying to keep something cool or when you're trying to keep something warm. The other thing to note here is that the coating is hard up against the substrate, and the coating itself doesn't really hold any significant moisture. So when you compare this to your foams and other insulation products like your glass wool insulation, things like that, there's no air gap, there's no moisture that can get in underneath this. It's a protective coating at the same time as it is insulation. We're talking 1, 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters maybe in particular situations, depending on how much energy you want to, or how much energy reduction you want. One, you shouldn't get any corrosion because it's protecting your substrate from corrosion. But two, you're actually able to detect corrosion a lot easier. You don't have to pull your cladding off, you don't have to pull the insulation off to actually check to see what's happening. So corrosion under insulation is basically eliminated. They don't test comparatively with thick insulation systems. So the standards that are out there for those thick insulations don't really cater for this kind of mechanism. So, you know, we've come up with all our own design guides based on giving equivalent insulation to normal insulation systems, but you get a lot more benefit out of it, particularly when you're in situations where you're worried about corrosion under insulation or sweating within a building envelope, for instance, sweating of tanks, things like that. I hope that makes sense. That's a very simplified version of it. There's a lot going on. It's not just convective. It basically acts in all three heat transfer mechanisms to help slow down that the rate of heat flow. Thanks.